Picture this. You're lying in bed when a siren slices through the silence of the night. It's not a test. It's not some weather alarm. This one is different, lower, heavier, mechanical in a way that makes your chest feel like it's vibrating. Instinctively, you grab your phone, but there's no signal. No internet, no news feed, nothing but static. You look out your window, and the horizon glows red like the sky itself is on fire. And for the first time, the thought hits you. If World War III has started, what happens not just to you, but to the place you live? The four walls you thought would always protect you. What happens to your home and everything inside it? The question feels almost surreal, but it's not. Right now, world leaders are speaking words that generations before us only whispered about. In 2025, Donald Trump has repeatedly stated that American boots will not march blindly into Eastern Europe, but instead the nation must be prepared to defend itself in ways no one expects. On the other side, Vladimir Putin of Russia continues to test the limits, sending convoys and threats into the heart of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping of China is quietly but steadily building new footholds in the Pacific. And in the middle of it all, civilians, ordinary people like you, are left asking one of the most practical questions of survival. If the unthinkable really happens, do I lose my home? Does everything I own vanish overnight? Let's break this down step by step, because the truth isn't as simple as people think. The very first hour after a global conflict begins is chaos. Sirens, alerts, people pouring into the streets. And in that moment, your property, your home, your apartment, the land your family has lived on, becomes something fragile. Governments may announce immediate emergency laws. That means the same house you've been paying mortgage on could be seized within hours, turned into a shelter, or worse, left completely abandoned. In World War II, we saw this exact thing happen across Europe. Ordinary families walked away from farms, shops, and houses, never to return. Now, in the age of satellite-guided missiles and hypersonic weapons, the destruction could come even faster. Imagine this. You live in a suburban neighborhood. The night is torn open by sirens, then by the first concussive blast of a strike hundreds of miles away. It doesn't matter if your home is not directly targeted. What matters is infrastructure. Electricity fails. Water stops running. Within hours, your home stops being a sanctuary and starts becoming a liability. For walls that trap you if fallout comes, or that mark you as someone still clinging to something others are desperate for. In a war like this, possession shifts from being legal to being practical. It's no longer about the deed or the mortgage papers you keep in a drawer. It's about who can hold that space, defend it, or hide within it. Governments know this. That's why, even now, buried in policy documents and contingency plans, there are quiet outlines of civilian requisition. That means your house can be taken, not by looters, not by a foreign army, but by your own government. In America, Trump's administration has spoken of controlled civilian support, a sterile phrase that in plain English means if your property is needed, it won't be yours anymore. In Russia, Putin has already normalized the idea of state control in emergencies. And in China, Xi's government doesn't even need to justify it. In all three cases, ownership as you know it disappears the second war breaks out. But here's where it gets darker. In the first days of World War III, most people won't be worrying about paperwork or deeds. They'll be worrying about survival. That's when abandoned homes, rows of silent, darkened buildings, become scavenging grounds. History shows this with brutal clarity. In Sarajevo during the Balkan Wars, people stripped homes not just of valuables, but of wood, doors, furniture, anything that could be burned to stay alive. In Ukraine today, homes in once bustling towns stand empty, gutted by artillery or looted by soldiers and desperate civilians alike. So, if you're thinking your carefully decorated living room, your electronics, your closets filled with clothes would survive the storm, you're mistaken. The truth is, war eats homes alive, not just with bombs, but with desperation. Picture the first week after the sirens. You're gone, maybe forced into a shelter, maybe evacuated by bus, maybe hiding in the countryside. Your house is still standing, at least for now. But the laws of society have shifted. Someone sees your empty home and steps inside. At first, maybe they just want food. Then, they take what they need to survive. Soon, it's no longer your home, but theirs. And the strange thing is, in war, that doesn't feel like theft. It feels like inevitability. Now let's step back. Suppose you survive the first wave of strikes, and the world powers pull back just enough to avoid total annihilation. What happens next? In that gray zone between fighting and uneasy truce, governments often create new rules of ownership. Trump might push for temporary compensation programs, promising Americans they'll be reimbursed later. Putin, on the other hand, could nationalize property outright, folding it into the state machine. She might assign your house to temporary citizens, a bureaucratic phrase for relocated families or soldiers. And if your home is destroyed, it becomes a statistic, a line in a report, a number in an endless list. But here's the truly haunting part. Even if your house survives intact, even if no soldier sets foot inside, the world around it may collapse so completely that ownership becomes meaningless. If the power grid is gone, if water no longer flows, if food chains break down, your beautiful home is just a box with walls. And you'll have to ask yourself, do I stay in it, risking attack, or do I walk away? Like so many millions have done before me, this is where the cinematic truth of war collides with the ordinary lives we live every day. You go to work, you pay bills, you plan vacations, but behind it all, your home feels permanent. World War III would rip that illusion away in hours, and as you sit there listening to sirens and scanning the horizon for the glow of another strike, you'll realize that permanence was always the greatest illusion of all. We will delve a little deeper, because if your home is seized, destroyed, or abandoned, the question changes. What would you do in that situation? Would you fight to defend it, try to reclaim it later, or accept that survival is more important than property? And even if the bombs stop, what does home mean in a world where maps are being redrawn and leaders like Trump, Putin, and Xi hold the reins of civilization? The sirens have faded, and you're no longer asking if your home will survive, but what you should do now that it's already in danger. The first and most brutal truth is this: you can't defend a house the way you imagine. Hollywood loves to show lone survivors barricading doors, standing guard with a rifle, protecting their family home against waves of chaos. But reality isn't like that. If the lights are out across the city, if the government has imposed curfews or military patrols, staying put makes you a target. Donald Trump, the current president of the United States in 2025, has already hinted in his briefings that federal forces may be forced to reallocate resources. That's a nice way of saying your home might not belong to you if it's needed for troops, refugees, or emergency supply stations. In Russia, Vladimir Putin's system already thrives on seizing control, so in their territory, the decision is even faster. And in China, Xi Jinping would not hesitate for a second to declare entire neighborhoods strategic zones and empty them out. So if staying put is dangerous, what about leaving? This is where the decisions fracture into two paths, each carrying a terrible cost. The first path is evacuation. You hear announcements on radios or through crackling emergency speakers. Civilians must move to designated shelters. But designated shelters are rarely what they seem. In past wars, people were packed into basements, stadiums, tunnels. Once you leave your home to follow evacuation orders, chances are you will never see it again. And yet, if you refuse, the second path opens, staying in the ruins, clinging to walls that no longer provide safety. In that scenario, you may avoid the government taking your house, but you will not avoid looters, soldiers, or even desperate neighbors who will come searching for food. Think of history's examples. In Berlin, 1945, people who refused to abandon their homes watched as Soviet soldiers kicked down doors. In Aleppo during the Syrian War, families stayed in apartments even as artillery cracked the walls, until one by one the buildings collapsed on top of them. In Ukraine today, stories emerge of villagers who refuse to leave their homes, only to lose both their property and their lives when missile strikes came. In every case, the home is no longer a shelter. but a trap. Now, imagine yourself in that same situation. The war has erupted. Trump holds emergency broadcasts telling Americans to stay calm, assuring them that FEMA will coordinate. But the images on your screen tell a different story. Cities burning, refugee lines stretching for miles, and you glance back at your own house. The photos on the wall, the furniture you worked years to buy. You realize that even if you come back, it won't look the same. It might be stripped, damaged, or occupied. The question becomes more psychological than physical. How much of your identity is tied to your home? In peaceful times, the house represents stability, success, belonging. In wartime, it represents vulnerability. Some people will fight for it until their last breath. Others will walk away without a glance because they know survival isn't about walls, it's about mobility. But here's the twist. Property in a World War III scenario doesn't just disappear. It becomes currency. Governments use it. Armies use it. Even civilians use it. If you have a house in the countryside, suddenly it becomes more valuable than gold because it offers space and maybe farmland. If you're in a city apartment, it becomes worthless in seconds unless soldiers need it as a lookout post, in which case it becomes deadly to be associated with it. And if you're a refugee who fled, your old home becomes a bargaining chip in political negotiations. Trump might one day declare compensation for displaced Americans. Putin might reassign your home to a loyal supporter. She might turn it into state housing. Either way, it will be out of your hands. Suppose the war drags on for months. You're living in a shelter or moving constantly. Meanwhile, your property is changing hands. Someone else may be living in it, or maybe it's destroyed in a strike. But here's the haunting part. Even when wars end, property doesn't magically return. After World War II, families spent decades in legal battles trying to reclaim stolen houses, and many never succeeded. After the Yugoslav wars, homes were rebuilt, but ownership was permanently altered. The person who comes back after years of displacement is never the same, and the home they return to isn't either. This reality forces civilians to think about something they never want to consider. What is home if not the physical walls? In a global conflict, survival shifts that meaning. Maybe your home becomes wherever you can protect your loved ones. Maybe it's in a shelter deep underground. Maybe in a foreign country where you find refuge. The heartbreaking part is this. Most people won't realize that until it's too late. They'll waste precious time trying to protect their houses, their cars, their property deeds. And while they do, others will be running, surviving, adapting. In these moments, leadership plays a critical role. Trump's rhetoric about protecting American property may sound comforting, but in reality, even he cannot guarantee safety in a nuclear or cyber war. Putin's promises of Russian glory don't feed or house the people whose apartments are reduced to rubble. Xi's control may keep order, but it also means the state decides who gets to live where. Across all systems, one truth emerges. When the bombs fall, property rights vanish. Survival becomes the only law. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. What if you do survive? What if months later, the war slows, negotiations begin, and you try to return? That's when the final shock hits. Your house is gone, or worse, it's still standing, but no longer yours. Maybe it's occupied by soldiers who won't leave. Maybe it's been claimed by a family that fled their own destroyed city. Maybe the government itself has signed it away, and you're left with nothing but memories of what it once was. This isn't just theory. This is history repeating itself, dressed in modern clothes. A world war would shred not just nations, but the very idea of ownership. And as you sit in a shelter, listening to distant explosions, the question of what happens to my home transforms into something more haunting. Will the idea of home ever exist again? The smoke lingers longer than the explosions. Entire blocks stand silent, gutted like skeletons against the gray sky. And somewhere in that silence, you ask yourself, if I ever return, what will I actually find? The reality of a world war is that property doesn't just vanish in the moment of destruction. It decays in slow layers of neglect, confiscation, and abandonment. First comes the fire and the impact. Windows shattered, roofs collapsed, walls cracked. If your home wasn't destroyed outright, Then the next threat is exposure. Rain pours in through holes, mold spreads, rats claim the corners, gardens turn wild, streets become rivers of rubble. The house that once held life now becomes part of a ghost neighborhood. But then another layer sets in: occupation. Soldiers on all sides know the value of shelter. If an army marches through, they will take what's left. Maybe your living room becomes command post, the basement a makeshift armory, the upstairs a lookout. Your family photos are shoved aside, your bed slept in by strangers with rifles leaning on the frame. And once an army has used your home, it carries a permanent mark. It may be burned as they retreat, booby-trapped, or shelled again by the enemy to deny them shelter. And yet, even occupation isn't the final stage, because after the armies leave, scavengers arrive. Civilians who lost everything strip houses piece by piece. Doors are torn off for firewood, copper wiring pulled out of walls, bricks carried away to rebuild elsewhere. What's left isn't just a ruined building, it's a carcass. Now picture the moment peace is declared, if peace even comes. You walk back, across a landscape scarred by weeks, months, maybe years of fighting. You find the street where you once lived. The outline of your home is there, but it is no longer yours. It's a wreck, a monument to time and war. Even worse, sometimes it isn't a wreck at all. It's occupied by someone else. Refugees who needed shelter moved in. Another family, displaced from another destroyed city, now lives behind your old door. And they may not leave simply because you showed up with a faded property deed. In their eyes, you left, they stayed. They survived. Ownership is rewritten not by law, but by survival. This is where the cruelest lesson of war unfolds. Property rights, which feel absolute in peace, become fragile threads in war. Courts may not exist. Lawyers may have fled. Records may be burned. And so the state steps in, redefining who owns what. Donald Trump, addressing the United States as its president in 2025, might promise displaced families compensation. He might push emergency legislation offering federal buyouts, but that doesn't restore the photographs, the kitchen table, the garden where your children once played. In Russia, Vladimir Putin may declare seized properties as rewards for loyal families, reshaping entire cities in favor of his supporters. In China, Xi Jinping's system would likely absorb abandoned homes into the state housing pool, erasing private ownership altogether. And here's where survival collides with memory. You might decide to fight to reclaim your property. People did after every major war, petitioning governments, bringing photographs, begging for justice. But more often than not, those battles lasted decades, with little hope of victory. And by then, you may be too old, too weary, or too broken to care. So the deeper question rises like a shadow over everything. Is a home a place, or is it the people inside it? Because when World War III tears across borders, most families will learn the same lesson. Home is not walls, not deeds, not property. Home is wherever you can protect the ones you love. Maybe that's in a bunker, maybe in a refugee camp, maybe on the road to another country. In the chaos of total war, the meaning of home transforms. But there is one more cruel possibility. In the event of nuclear strikes, your property doesn't just risk occupation or decay. It risks erasure. Entire neighborhoods would vanish in flashes of light. Radiation zones could make entire cities uninhabitable for decades. In that case, there isn't even rubble to reclaim. There is only emptiness, cordoned off, forbidden. A place where your home once stood, but now no one can ever live again. Imagine trying to explain to your children that their childhood house isn't just gone, it's poison. And while you mourn what is lost, governments calculate. Trump's advisors talk openly about rebuilding programs, but even they admit that resources will be limited. Rebuilding New York or Washington or Los Angeles after a strike would require unimaginable wealth, and the priority would be military bases, transport routes, not suburban houses. Putin, too, would rebuild military zones before villages. She would focus on infrastructure, ports, and key cities. Civilians would always be last in line. That means even if the war ends, even if the bombs stop falling, your home may remain a ruin for years, or forever. Yet, within all this horror, One last haunting question lingers. What if you never left? Some families, even in the darkest wars, refuse to abandon their homes. They sit in basements while shells fall, cook over open fires while the city collapses, cling to bricks because leaving feels like surrender. Sometimes they survive, and their house, though scarred, remains a miracle of endurance. But more often, they vanish in silence, buried in the very place they swore to protect. The tragedy of those stories is that they confuse home with walls, when in truth, home was always the people around them. And so, as the sirens fade and the firelight dims, the answer to the question, what happens to your home and property in World War III, is both simple and devastating. You lose it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in one form or another, it will slip from your hands, whether through bombs, occupation, confiscation, or decay. The house you once called yours cannot survive a world at war. What you can carry, what you can protect, is not the deed or the walls, but the life inside them. Because in a war that threatens to consume the globe, the only property that truly matters is survival itself.